welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchelin. In our last episode, the PRI All-Stars provided their analysis and predictions for the California June ballot. And since we believe in competition here at PRI, we're back to see just how well they did. So here's our All-Star team: Carrie Jackson, PRI Fellow of our Center for California Reform, Tim Anaya, Director of Communications, and Ben Smithwick, Director of Development. Welcome back, gentlemen. What's your major takeaway from the voters on Tuesday? What do the results say about the mood of California's voters?
I think the mood is largely the same as it has been for about a decade or so. The voters seem to be doing what they do every 2 years in this state. Nothing seems to have changed. That said, what we didn't see was an outpouring of the resistance, which Sacramento, the legislature, really tried to lead that a year and a half ago. And it tried to stir up people. And I think the only people they stirred up were the people who were already agitated. I don't think the voters had bought into the resistance. I don't see any changes, anything there that indicate that. So I think the mood is, despite the resistance, despite the Trump election, I think that the mood has been about the same for the last decade, maybe a little longer, among voters.
Well, for me, the major takeaway from the election overall, not necessarily from voters, is that Democrats really avoided disaster by having two Republicans on the ballot in some key congressional races. This certainly, I guess, came at a cost. I think it's estimated that nationally, Democrats spent over $7 million to be competitive in three GOP-held House districts. So if they are able to take back the House in November, it will be because, I think, in part because of their decision to spend and to be competitive here in California. I think it's difficult to say where voters are generally. They essentially rubber-stamped every statewide ballot measure except for Prop 70, which would have required the legislature to pass new cap-and-trade spending plans with two-thirds support starting in a few years. So I think it's hard to say whether the outcome for that initiative would have been the same in the general election, but it's clear that the progressive ideology is still dominant in California.
The low turnout in yesterday's primary really shows that voters across the spectrum are still upset with the status quo in Sacramento. You know, right now we're at a turnout of 21% statewide so far, and that number will surely go up as more ballots are counted. You know, I haven't seen a number yet from the Secretary of State, but my guess is we'll have about, maybe another 1 million to 2 million votes left to be counted. But, you know, really, despite tens of millions of dollars spent in the governor's race, they still weren't motivated to turn out. And I think it's a statement by voters that they don't think it really matters who wins in November, that the status quo will continue and their vote doesn't really matter.
Looking at the results, what would you say was the biggest surprise?
I don't know if I have any surprises. I think as far as what I was assuming was going to happen or thinking was going to happen, I think it pretty much happened that way. If I did have a surprise, I think it would be the total votes the Republicans picked up in the governor's race. Maybe I'm out there on the limb on this or out there by myself, but the Cox and was it Travis Allen picked up 1.4 million. Roughly. Actually, it's going to be 1.4 million, which was more than Newsom got. But again, when the general election comes around, he's going to get Viragosa's votes and John Chang's votes. So it's not going to change anything in the general election, I don't think. But that was a little bit of a surprise to me. And as I was going to bed last night, I looked at the numbers that were still early and was a little surprised at that point. It might surprise some folks, or at least for me, come the general election in November, that it might be a more competitive race than we had expected it to be. That would be the only thing out of this entire, to me, out of the primary from yesterday that sticks out as being something I didn't expect.
Well, I was surprised by how well Marshall Tuck did in his race for superintendent of public instruction. He had ran a few years ago, and since he has supported charter schools and some education reform initiatives in the past, he had a pretty difficult time at the Democratic Party convention. And his opponent, Thurmond, is the candidate favored by the CTA. And it's a really important race that's overlooked in the media, but I think it might receive more attention if the union decides to become more active and spend more in the run-up to the general.
So one surprise that I would say, and really is more of a weird result, is what happened in the race for the 32nd state Senate seat. And to remind our listeners, this was the strange race. It was actually two races in one. There was a special election to fill the seat of Senator Tony Mendoza, who resigned over allegations of sexual harassment. And then at the same time, there was a primary election to fill the seat in the full term in November. And then to make things even weirder, Mendoza was actually running in both races. Well, the surprise was that two different Democrats won the election. You had Montebello Mayor Vanessa Delgado. She was the top Democrat vote getter in the special election, and now that goes to a runoff, and she will probably win in the runoff. I believe it's in August. And then she'll probably have the privilege of serving for just 4 months, because Pico Rivera Councilman Bob Archuleta was the top Democrat vote getter for the full term, and that election, the top two, will be in November. Another surprise I thought was Speaker Rendon polling under 50% overall, with a Democrat challenger taking nearly 30% of the vote. Now, we're under no illusion that Speaker Rendon is in any trouble in November, but I think that is another example showing the voting power of the extreme progressive left, who targeted him over his leadership on the single-payer legislation, SB 562. Finally, I think the biggest surprise of all was perhaps a Republican candidate for Assembly, Justin Mendes, outpolling the Democratic incumbent, Assemblyman Rudy Salas, in a Bakersfield area Assembly seat, and this is a Democrat plus 21 Assembly seat. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes in the fall.
Now, the fall gubernatorial campaign has been set. In your view, what are the sharpest policy differences between the two, and how would they differ from Governor Brown?
The difference in these two, Newsom and Cox, and I hate to go and use a cliche, but it's the easiest way and the most clear way to get this point across. It's a difference. It's night and day. It's very stark. I don't think you'll find a bigger difference in any state between two candidates in any statewide race anywhere in the country. I think the polarization of this country is probably strongest political polarization in California. And I think that's reflected in the two candidates that we're going to end up having to vote for in November for governor. And there's pretty straight up where these gentlemen are. Newsom is going to be a progressive. He is going to try to increase the role of government in our lives, where on the other side, Cox, I would like to say he's going to fight to shrink government. I think the best that he could possibly do, Republicans at this point in the state, they can do is maybe slow down the growth of government. These are big differences. They are complete polar opposites, complete ends of the political spectrum. From I just don't. Like I said, I think on a national, if you look across the country, I don't think you're going to see two candidates at state level who have more between them.
I agree, Kerry. I think in the run-up to the general election, we'll probably see a lot of discussion about immigration and education, two issues where both candidates could not be further apart. Newsom has essentially been Governor Brown's understudy, and I think that there's concern among more moderate voters that he will not hold the line on pension reform and some other fiscal issues like Brown has to a limited degree. But regardless, I think as evidenced by Newsom's victory speech, he'll do anything and whatever it takes to make this a referendum on President Trump, and will certainly try to tap into, I think, anti-Trump fervor on the campaign trail and in his advertising. So we'll see.
I think Ben is right on there. Cox would have to be, he'd be in constant and total war with the legislature in Sacramento, while I think Newsom will probably be led around by the legislature. I don't think he has enough political capital to really push forward an agenda that he might want to. I think maybe if he gets reelected, he may get that much political capital. But again, if we look at some of the big issues of the day, Cox is for repealing the California Environmental Quality Act. I don't see that out of Newsom. I don't think Newsom has had the rational criticisms of CEQA or the public employee pension problem that we saw out of Brown.
Cox also has been quoting a lot of your good work, Carrie, on California's poverty problems as well. And I saw him today say that his campaign is really going to be focused on the difference between Venezuela and the California dream. Now, that is an interesting contrast for the fall, but as I said on our primary preview podcast, it doesn't really matter what the differences are between the two because, with Cox finishing in second place on Tuesday, California has virtually elected Gavin Newsom as governor. Now, Cox has also said that he's going to base the fall campaign on the repeal of the gas tax increase, and there's certainly a sharp difference between Brown and Cox and Newsom on taxes and transportation funding. It's interesting. Gavin Newsom really hasn't been pure on one transportation issue, and that's high-speed rail. You could charitably say that he's flip-flopped on the issue over the years. He supported it, then he opposed it. Now he supports it again. Remember, Gavin Newsom's platform is promoting himself. When he was in San Francisco, he started out as a, quote, pro-business moderate, and then he's evolved over the years into the liberal warrior that he's become. I think that he'll be wherever the popular wind blows this November. And I don't know that I agree about the legislature leading him around. I think he's actually going to give the legislature fits because he's going to be promoting Gavin Newsom. He's not going to be promoting the Democrat team. And in that way, he might be kind of similar to how Governor Brown has governed and worked with Democrats in the legislature.
We also have the U.S. Senate campaign set. What policy areas do you think will be the major areas of disagreement between the two?
Well, when it comes to how things are going to be coming out of Washington, no matter which one is elected, I don't think that's going to make a lot of difference. That's just going to, they're going to be one, whoever it is, going to be one of 100 senators, and they're both going to be somewhat similar. But yes, Feinstein is left. De Leon is a hard left. If they were running against each other, say for governor, there would be a lot of policy disagreements, and these would affect California. But I don't see California necessarily being affected by whichever one of these candidates is elected and sent to Washington. As far as how this is going to affect California, even though there are going to be some areas of disagreement between the two, I don't see a big effect on California simply, again, because I said there are only going to be one out of 100 senators. And it's not like one is going to be, we're even going to get a Democrat or Republican out of this. We're getting one of two Democrats, one left and one far left.
Well, one of the issues, as maybe some listeners to this podcast will know, that we've been focusing on at PRI is the push for single-payer healthcare in California and nationally. And I think that will be an issue, maybe not the top issue, but I think it will be an issue in the race. Feinstein was actually booed at an event last year because she said that single payer is not the answer. That De Leon, I think, has also been critical for supporting domestic surveillance, but otherwise they have pretty similar policy positions. As I mentioned before, I think what might help Feinstein in the general election is some support from moderate and more conservative voters who see her as the slightly better candidate when it comes to policy.
If I may jump in, I think it's going to be interesting to see these two go head-to-head in a fall campaign and what the Democratic Party is going to do. Let's not forget how things were earlier when your time is up chant was directed at Feinstein. There's some that are hard far left that are in De Leon's camp that are not going to be happy with her, and it may turn into a bit of a civil war there. So that will be an interesting point to watch as the campaign heats up late summer, early fall.
And Feinstein certainly has been moving to the left over the years. She just famously announced that she's changed her position on the death penalty, which was really one of the hallmarks of her political career, getting booed at the Democratic convention when she was running for governor back in 1990 for supporting the death penalty. I think that De Leon really had a disastrous primary night. I mean, he almost lost to a no-name Republican. So I'm really curious to see if the left-wing groups and the unions that are restless and want kind of an activist warrior in the Senate are still going to be all in November when he's pretty much shown he ain't going to get elected. And I'm curious to see just how all in they will be in November with money and the troops based on his poor showing. But I think you're both right. She's certainly going to be in for a big fight. Whether she's going to have to sweat it on election night in November is another question. But certainly the activists, the left, the extreme progressive left is going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at her.
Based on the preliminary results, how do you think the top two primary fared yesterday? Do you think the results will increase a call for reform or just scrapping the system?
Outside of the Senate race between, it's going to give us Dianne Feinstein and Kevin De Leon, I think the outcome would have been fairly similar if it had been a more traditional primary where each party puts their candidate up for the general election in the fall. I think it's going to play out a little bit more. They're not going to I don't think they're going to, after this election, there's going to be a groundswell to say we got to get rid of this. It's not working. I think it's going to play out for a few more elections. It seems to not be working the way some people wanted it to. I think that initially the idea behind it was to try to moderate the voting and the voters, and that seems to have not happened. But we'll see. This is 2018. We'll see a couple more primary seasons and see what happens from there. See if the people in charge of the parties, how they perceive it and how they want where they want to go with it.
Sure, I tend to agree with that, Gary. There was certainly a lot of concern in the run-up to Tuesday, most notably from Kevin McCarthy, who said in a media interview that he thought the system had destroyed the Republican Party in California. And I think that's a point that can be debated. But I think as of now, it looks like Democrats were not shut out of any critical races in the state, and they're really the ones in this state, at least, with the power to do something about changing the system, and I really don't see it changing anytime soon.
And Ben, you're exactly right. Ironically, it was the Republicans who were the victims of the top two yesterday. There was a race that not many people were keeping eye on, Assembly District 76 in San Diego. And as of now, 2 Democrats have made the top 2, shutting out the Republicans in November. And keep in mind, this was considered a pretty safe Republican seat. It was the seat vacated by Assemblyman Rocky Chavez, who also lost his congressional race on Tuesday. Keep in mind, in 2016, Chavez got 60% of the vote in this district. So also, I want to give a shout out to our friend John Myers from the LA Times, who runs our favorite podcast on California politics, the California Politics Podcast. And he rightfully pointed out on Twitter yesterday that the November election is not a runoff, and yesterday's vote was not a jungle primary either. It is a top 2 primary system, and we've been very good in talking about it, not referring to it in either way. So,
given what voters said yesterday, what do you think it portends for the big ballot measures looming in the fall, like rent control?
I think there's some momentum, and given how many votes John Cox got, I think there's going to be some momentum moving into the fuel tax repeal in November. I would not be at all surprised at this point. A couple of weeks ago, I was skeptical. I think now I would not be at all surprised if it wasn't repealed, if that measure didn't become approved. In fact, I'll almost go out and handicap that and say it's going to win the repeal of that. Not so sure about what we're talking about in rent control and the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. I fear, and I'm trying not to insult voters, but I think most voters don't really have the knowledge of economics enough to make a really informed decision on that. I think so many will see it and say, yeah, we shouldn't let people charge whatever they want, whatever they can get, and, push people out of homes, and there should be some sort of control on what they can, which rent they can charge. So I don't. That may happen. They may vote for that to get rid of the what essentially is the protections against rent control.
I really think it's difficult to say at this point what will happen with some of the ballot measures. In November, there was very little money spent on advertising for ballot measures this time around compared to some previous races. I think we will probably see big campaigns for the gas tax repeal, rent control, and probably even the Humane Society's cage-free ballot measure, which I've written about in the past. And I think what's interesting is that both Newsom and Cox oppose repealing Costa-Hawkins. So I think it will probably really come down to how the measure is written and how effective both sides are in educating voters on a complicated issue.
And I agree with Kerry. I think last night's results give a huge boost to the campaign to repeal the gas tax, just evidenced by the recall of Senator Josh Newman, who was largely recalled over his vote being the deciding vote to impose the $52 billion gas tax hike, and also his vote for single payer. I think that's a huge shot of momentum for the gas tax repeal.
Finally, now that the matchups are set, what's the one race that you're going to be watching the closest this fall, and why?
I won't be necessarily watching a race between human beings so closely as I will the ballot measures. That's where the big turns have been made in California political history, and I think that's what we need to be looking at. Well, that's what I'm going to be most interested in. I would not, as I say, I think I'm surprised, or some people may be surprised that the governor's race is going to be a little more competitive than we otherwise thought it would have been, or previously thought it was going to be. But I think the rest of the races are going to come down to not necessarily be too exciting or too surprising, but this is the ballot measures where I'm going to be looking.
I agree, Kerry. I'll just throw in a couple of congressional races. I think probably the most interesting will be House District 48, where it looks like Dana Rohrabacher might face a Democrat in the general election. Right now, I think the total votes for the Democrats who came in second and third exceed the total votes that Dana received. So it'll be close either way. Also in northern Los Angeles County, House District 25, some of our listeners might remember that because of the top two primary system, Steve Knight ended up facing Tony Strickland back in 2014 in the general, and he won again in 2016. And this time around, there were 4 Democrats, mostly political newcomers, I think, and it's unclear who at this point will be the challenger, but this is an important race to watch, particularly given the money that's expected to be spent on both sides, Democrats and Republicans.
And that made me very happy that Steve Knight won in 2014, and I won't go into that story on this podcast. I will say that I'm watching the lieutenant governor's race. As of this point now, it's going to be 2 candidates from the Democrats, Eleni Kolinakis, who's a businesswoman and the daughter of the big developer and lavish political donor Angelos Tsakopoulos, and State Senator Ed Hernandez, who's known for the push to champion the individual mandate and single payer and all of that. I had the chance to attend the Sacramento Press Club debate on this earlier this couple of months back, and I wrote about it for our blog. And back then I talked about there was a lot of political chess being played among all the different candidates for that race. And now that it's 2 Democrats in the fall, there'll be even more chess being played. And I think really the deciding factor is going to be Republicans. Are they going to sit out this race? I would argue Kolinakis has a lot more appeal to Republicans as a businesswoman, and she championed freezing tuition at California's public colleges and universities. But who will Republicans even engage in that? And there's a lot of school of thought with the open or with the top 2 primary that Republicans in large part sit out the general election when it's a top 2 Democrat top 2 election. So that will be interesting to see.
From our all-star team, Kerry Jackson, Tim Anaya, and Ben Smithwick, thanks for joining us. And if you can't get enough of our PRI All-Stars, visit our blog, Right by the Bay, at pacificresearch.org. Also, if you're in the Los Angeles area, we invite you to a luncheon on June 29th with Andy Puzder, former CEO of CKE Restaurant, to discuss his new book, Capitalists Come Back. Details are also on our website. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.